Okay, it's 2/20 of 2015. We're going to take a look at the next section of Robert Jenson's Systematic Theology, Volume 1. We've looked at his hermeneutic, his mini-class in hermeneutics. We've looked at his Doctrine of the Father that intrinsically carries the key attribute of temporality and temporal incarnation. And now we're going to take a look at the Doctrine of the Son, and we're going to look at, of course, it's given the generally recognized notion from systematic theology of the hypostatic union between essence and actuality that takes place in the Christ of Jesus of Nazareth. So it's usually referred to as hypostatic union, the doctrine of hypostatic union, or hypostasis is the Greek term, but hypostasis essentially means the union between essence and actuality, and that can be a general term for incarnation overall, also, not simply hypostatic union. So we're going to take a look at the Doctrine of the Son that is outlined for us by Robert Jenson, and it will build on what he's already told us concerning the negation of impassibility and the intrinsic nature of God the Father as centrally defined by temporal narrative. And so Jenson begins by saying that if we're going to concentrate on temporal narrative and temporal narratives throughout in order to find our identity of deity, then the Doctrine of the Son is going to speak primarily toward coherence. The coherence that he describes as dramatic coherence that is evident throughout narrative, temporal narrative. And that's his first moment. It's going to be a dramatic coherence that is evident throughout temporal narrative. That's where we begin with our definition and doctrine of the Son. God's hypostatic being is constituted in dramatic coherence. So we can see here that Jenson's kind of building on his theological grammatology, isn't he? God's hypostatic being is constituted in dramatic coherence. Dramatic coherence is identified within the context of contingency. So again, he's getting away from the Greek classical terms, and he's getting us out of that metaphysical world, and he's taking us to the context of contingency. Dramatic coherence equals the continuity within the discontinuity of contingency. The continuity within the discontinuity of contingency defines the dramatic coherence and the presence of the incarnate Son. The crisis point of dramatic coherence is obviously equal to the crucifixion and the abandonment in crucifixion, that extreme temporal event that we heard about in the last section. So the crisis point of the dramatic coherence within temporal narrative is the abandonment in crucifixion. And Jenson says God's identity must be integrated into this moment of extreme temporal abandonment. God himself, God's identity, must be integrated into this notion of abandonment. So the first moment is the moment of coherence. The second moment for the Doctrine of the Son is closure. The three moments are going to be coherence, closure, and identity. So we've covered coherence, that dramatic coherence within temporal narrative, and now we're going to talk about closure of dramatic coherence as anticipation. And what Jenson says is that there must be a moment of eventual closure of dramatic coherence. It doesn't stay open-ended. There must be an eventual closure in order to formulate doctrine. So there is an eventual closure of dramatic coherence within temporal narrative. Abandonment equals the moment of supreme dramatic self-transcendence. Abandonment equals the moment of supreme dramatic self-transcendence. God's narrative with humanity must reach this extreme temporal end of death and abandonment. I mean, what's the absolute extremity of finitude? It is death and abandonment. That is the absolute extreme, far-reaching end of temporality and finitude. So God's narrative with humanity, which is the doctrine of the Son, the narrative with humanity must reach the temporal extreme end point of death itself. Crisis and resolution are depicted in the death and resurrection. Crisis and resolution are depicted in the narrative of death and resurrection. So closure is established as an anticipation. Closure equals opening. Okay, there's a good play on words for you. Closure equals opening. It's a specific eschatological future which is anticipated and opened up through this death and resurrection. A specific eschatological future which is anticipated and opened up. So the closure becomes the Christ event that where deity reaches to this extreme temporal endpoint of death and abandonment, and the resurrection qualifies that reaching to temporal endpoint by opening it to becoming a specific eschatological future which is anticipated. So closure for Jenson equals Adventus. It's an Adventus of deity that keeps historical narrative from becoming predictive futurum. So we don't have a Greek classical period idea of rationalism. We don't have the rational futurum. We have the vertical slice of Adventus, of the divine Adventus, entering into historical narrative and keeping it from becoming predictive futurum. So Adventus trumps futurum. Examples: Israel's liberation from Egypt resulted in an opened future of 40 years of wandering in the desert. For Israel, God posited a contingent future to define their liberation. Their liberation wasn't, as we all know from the narrative, their liberation included a very much contingent wandering in the desert. So it was for Israel, God posited a contingent future and a contingent wandering. And that's in the Old Testament. And I just finished a little look at Paul, and I think it's interesting that Paul had to follow up his conversion experience in Damascus with a 10-year contingent wandering and redefining of his theological wisdom. He returned to Tarsus for 10 to 14 years, and that's kind of equated with the desert wandering, but it's the New Testament example we have. It kind of corresponds to this Old Testament example. There's an open-ended future that includes contingency that is opened up. Now, Israel's sin was misunderstanding covenant and seeking a desire for a religious and political unchanging existence where they could contain God's glory. They didn't take to the idea of discovering God in contingency. They wanted to lock it all up in rigidity and build the house out of mortar and stone to contain the Shekinah glory of God. So the closure, the closest that it can get to becoming a concretion, according to Jenson, is it's always going to be defined as God's occurring word of promise through Christ. God's occurring word of promise through Christ. Now the third moment is identity. We've looked at coherence, we looked at the closure and the Christ event, and now we're going to look at identity, the identity of the dramatic coherence as the kaiosune. The kaiosune is the Christian concept of righteousness. Dikaiosune, and of course, Jenson has to define it for the way he's going to use it, because we could misinterpret what he's saying here if he didn't. And as a good theologian, he defines his version of Dikaiosune. It equals having faith in God's drastic future openness. Having faith in God's drastic future openness. That's becoming aligned with the contingency and temporality. Righteousness is communal. God moved about in the desert with Israel in a tent tabernacle. The glory of God resided in a tent. And he moved about and wandered with Israel in the desert. So there is a very much an ontological difference concerning this definition of Dikaiosune righteousness. It only appears as an eschatological image. There is an inner unity through God's permanent epiphany. Israel and the church are to participate in God's eschatological reality within historical contingency. Israel and the church are to participate in God's eschatological reality within contingency. Righteousness is a historical category. It is always a historical category. So the dramatic coherence is defined as a movement, and eschatological movement and historical eschatological movement. A network of communal action between the pneuma spirit and the sarx finitude is constantly taking place, and we participate in that and perceive God with us in that contingent eschatological history. And Jenson gives a concluding statement: God created us in order to redeem us. Righteousness was inaugurated at creation. The righteousness as a telos of soteria was inaugurated at creation. The moment of creation included the moment of the redemption process. So the Doctrine of the Son will pass through coherence, closure, and identity. A coherence, a dramatic coherence of the temporal narrative. There is a thread of the aletheia truth as a dramatic coherence that threads its way through every temporal narrative. But it doesn't stay open-ended. It does reach closure in the Christ event. And it's a closure that has worked through the absolute extreme moment of crucifixion, death, and abandonment, and is opened in resurrection. But it is an opening as adventus and not predictive futurum. Adventus trumps futurum in this eschatological outlook. And then we reach the identity, and the identity is an identity that's defined in the category or the concept. It's more of a category because it has many sub-concepts that kind of can be broken down under it. But the concept of Dikaiosune, the concept of righteousness, and that is ultimately the Doctrine of the Son means having faith in God's drastic future openness, which is the image of the Shekinah sign-like glory of the Son, which in Greek is called the doxa glory, but in Hebrew it was the Shekinah glory. But in both instances, it's glory as sign. And if we all remember, Christ referred to himself as sign when he was questioned about, why don't you perform some signs and wonders for us? And he goes, you get nothing more than the sign of Nineveh, Jonah and Nineveh. And he says, you have a greater than Jonah now. I am the sign. And so it's this pointing toward this doxa glory or Shekinah glory of the Doctrine of the Son, representing this sign-like glory that is eschatologically present as a dramatic coherence in the midst of contingency. A dramatic sign-like coherence in the midst of contingency. And through our spiritual perception, we can see this dramatic sign-like coherence. So it's very much kind of a grammatology here, but he said he was kind of writing a theological grammar with his system. So he continues that theological grammar in here, the Doctrine of the Son. And from here, we're going to enter into what I think is a powerful chapter, the Doctrine of the Holy Spirit, next.